Culture is it's the sum of how people are really behaving and making decisions day in and day out. So that's what's real. The talking points are talking points, but the culture is real. And when the culture matches the talking points, I mean, that's when organizations shine.
We're joined today by Emily Miner. She's a director at Ethisphere, where she helps organizations enhance ethical business practices through evaluation, benchmarking, and strategic advice. Previously, she was vice president at LRN Corporation, leading global ethics and compliance advisory services. With a background in environmental science and sustainability, she contributed to UN climate policy efforts. Emily holds a Master of Public Administration from Columbia University and a degree in anthropology from the University of Florida. As certified compliance and ethics professional, she's presented at major compliance conferences and has been featured in Forbes, Agenda, and Fast Company. Welcome, Emily Miner. How are you?
I'm well. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, thank you for joining us. I just want to introduce you to our listeners. So Emily is a seasoned expert in ethics and compliance, and she's currently the Director of Data and Services at Ethisphere. I'd like to hear a bit more about that role in a moment. But first, how do I know Emily? Well, we both worked together before she joined Ethisphere. So Emily was dedicated for over a decade to advising global companies on E&C program effectiveness and ethical culture. And while she was vice president at LRN, that's when we met, because we worked together for, you're going to hate me for this, but 7 years, Emily. So talk to me a little bit, first of all, about Ethisphere. What are you doing there currently?
Yeah. Well, I think of Ethisphere as sort of having three parts to it. One is convening leaders in ethics and compliance from companies all around the world to discuss and share resources about topics that really are impacting all organizations, sometimes in a public fashion, but also sometimes in kind of a closed door session. So Ethisphere facilitates that peer-to-peer connection and information sharing. We're able to kind of match make people from different organizations that we know might be facing similar challenges or have had a great success in a particular area. So one aspect of our business is this leadership community that we've cultivated over decades. Another aspect of our business, I think of kind of as a think tank around pushing the needle on business ethics. So we conduct research and we do a lot of benchmarking around, ethical business practices. And kind of the marquee of this aspect of our business that is probably how most people are familiar with us is every year we publish World's Most Ethical Companies list. It's a very rigorous application process with a lot of, review of pretty sensitive and confidential information. I'm one of the reviewers on that team, so it's really amazing to be able to see a company and its business practices, not just related to the ethics and compliance program, but across the whole of its business. And then the third aspect of what we do is taking all of this, knowledge and insight and questions and helping our clients, figure out how to implement best practices within their own organizations. And so that's more of the advisory consulting aspect of our work. And I also, the data and services team that you mentioned, that's the team that I sit on, and we provide those services to clients, whether that's evaluating their programs or helping them draft policies or stand up ambassador programs or work with leadership, conduct board training, you name it. We're here to help our clients on their ethics journey.
I can totally see why you're part of that organization. All of that aligns with you, I think, and your expertise, which is wonderful. And I think the relationship side of it, the first part that you described, clearly resonates with me, because that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to connect people and really get them to support one another. And I think it's wonderful that you have that community going. If we sort of delve into that really and why you're part of this community, if you had to start at the very beginning, I used to do a lot of work around the environment, and I know, that's kind of your origins. We'd like to talk a little bit about that and how you transitioned into this field? I'd like to go right back and find out, because we never had that conversation when we worked together.
Yeah. No, and thank you for bringing it up. From the outside, it may seem like a somewhat circuitous journey, but it feels like a pretty straight line for me. And as you said, I did very early in my career. I worked for a few different nonprofits, both focusing on environmental sustainability. And I also went and pursued a graduate degree in that field. And so I was working in the environmental space, something that I'm very passionate about, still am. And I went to a book talk. The CEO of the Nature Conservancy had written a book, and he was giving a talk, and I attended. It was an organization that I really admired. And as it happened, in that book talk, I was introduced to the world of business ethics. And I had never heard of ethics or ethics and compliance as a function, as an industry. And it was honestly like a light bulb moment for me. Like this idea that there was a whole field dedicated to helping companies and their people do the right thing, grounded in their values, grounded in their principles, actualizing those values and principles. And I saw that as a way that, I could advance progress on issues that I care about deeply, such as the environment, but a whole myriad host of other really important issues. And I, that night said to myself, this is where I need to be. I see it as helping to change companies from within, which I find is so much more impactful than some CSR departments, which sometimes can be really embedded in organizations, but other times can kind of just be this group off to the side that does some philanthropy, but it doesn't really impact how the company is choosing the projects that it takes on and who they hire and how well they monitor their supply chain. I mean, and so ethics, I see that as kind of when you drop a pebble into the lake and the ripples extend outward. That's how I see ethics and compliance. So I talked myself into a job, and really, the rest is history. I've been doing this ever since.
And so that pivotal moment's really interesting to me because you're already making an impact where you were. Was it just the wider ripples that you're talking about? Was the feeling that you would amplify that? Is that what swung it, if you like?
Yeah, I think through the course of my earlier nonprofit career, and then through my graduate program, I had the opportunity to work on international climate policy. I took on some clients in which I and a few others were helping to draft international climate policy as part of the UN FCCC framework convention on climate change. I had some exposure to kind of how environmental issues can be addressed on the international intergovernmental sphere. And then after that, I worked in academia for a few years. So I felt like I had a little bit of nonprofit, a little bit of government, a little bit of academia. And while I value all of those experiences and think that they're all really important and necessary parts of our global society, really became impressed by how much further or faster business can move the world. And, companies are international in a way that national governments don't always have that influence. And I, just saw a number of case studies of how business decisions had impacted these sea changes. I mean, let's look at the car industry in the United States. While politically, our government's regulations on, emission standards or support for electrical vehicles has kind of gone up and down as the administrations have changed. Car manufacturers are still moving ahead because they know that that's what consumers want. They know that it's in the interest of their own business. They're also looking at regulations in the EU, which tend to be much stronger on the environment. And so it's sort of eh, anyway, I became to appreciate how impactful business is in just about anything in our world and in our society. And so that idea of kind of working from within businesses just felt like maybe the way that I could cascade the most ripples.
Absolutely, really make an impact. But as we both know from experience, I mean, we've both worked in a mission-driven company for many years, and the mission, if you like, is to make sure that those decisions those companies make effectively impact in a positive way, though, right? Because obviously that's a double-edged sword, that impact. So with that in mind, what made you gravitate towards culture and, if you like, establishing the culture of businesses so that positivity demonstrated by the companies in their actions? Because I know what my thoughts are on this, but I'm trying not to tell you to put words in your mouth because we both work for the same organization, right? So,
Yeah. Cultures, I believe so strongly in the importance of culture. And, that's where the rubber really meets the road. You can have all the, corporate values and mission statements and what have you published on the website. But culture is it's the sum of how people are really behaving and making decisions day in and day out. So that's what's real. The talking points are talking points, but the culture is real. And when the culture matches the talking points, I mean that's when organizations shine. And my undergraduate degree was in anthropology, and I focused on applied anthropology, which is sort of modern humans as opposed to the historical record. So understanding people and why we do what we do, it was always something that I was interested in. A lot of my work in the environmental sustainability sector was around decision making and behavior patterns related to the environment. And so it actually was a rather kind of natural continuation of that work. And so I spent the first 6 years really focusing on helping organizations measure their culture, figure out what those gaps were between what they wanted it to be or what they said they wanted it to be, and what was actually true, and then working with leadership teams to move the needle.
so with that in mind, all that experience, what has that taught you about why so many organizations struggle to get their culture right?
I point to a few reasons that I've observed. Starts out with leadership. Leaders really do have to believe that culture is important and that it's something that you need to be intentional about. Culture happens whether or not you shape it. So if you want it to happen in the way that is aligned with your business objectives, you need to be intentional about the messages that you're sending, the signals that you're sending, and aligning that talk and that walk. I think most organizations that I've worked with, the leaders have really cared about culture and recognized that it is important, not only um, in and of itself, but it also, as many studies have shown, can lead to greater business results, more positive business results, customer satisfaction, employee satisfaction, financial performance, et cetera. Actually, that's Ethisphere. As I mentioned, we do a lot of research and benchmarking and have for decades, and so this is something that we've been tracking for a really long time, comparing the performance of those world's most ethical honorees to their industry peer groups. And we call it the ethics premium. It kind of fluctuates year over year, but it's in general, 5 points or more higher than their industry peers, those world ethical nominees. So, but there's research from others, not just Ethisphere, of course, that highlight that. So while most organizations I've worked with have had supportive leaders, there will sometimes be pockets where there are leaders that are less kind of bought in, and that can be a challenge. So I think number one, you do need to have that commitment and that tone from the top, and that expectation very firmly cascaded down. One trend that I've been really following with interest is how I'm seeing more and more organizations start to incorporate ethical leadership, ethical behavior into key moments within the employee life cycle. So when someone is being considered for promotion or as a portion of your bonus potential, or as an element in your performance, your annual or whatever cadence performance review. And I think it's so fantastic because at the end of the day, that's what we're telling employees, like, what matters to us. Like, this is what we're measuring you on. So are we just measuring against results, or are we also measuring against how those results are achieved? And, watch this space, because in September 2024, the US Department of Justice updated its guidance on effective ethics programs and devoted almost 3 pages out of 25, so a pretty significant portion, I would say, to the discussion of incentives. What are we incentivizing, and what are we disincentivizing? So that's one example of how leaders, and organizations can, really send the signal that this is something that's important to us, in addition to our business results or shareholder returns or what have you. Leadership commitment is point number one. And then, just to offer one more, I think employees need to really feel that you mean it as an organization. And so it's things like holding the high performers to the same standards as everybody else, to being transparent about decision making and what's guiding that decision making, to being transparent about when we maybe made a misstep. I can't, so many times when I've worked with organizations and interviewed employees and conducted focus groups, I hear these stories around, um, failed rollouts of SAP or some other big organizational change, and it's everyone is clearly struggling. Clearly, there were issues. Clearly, it's impacted productivity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, the company is sort of just putting blinders on and not really acknowledging the real experience that is impacting everybody. And that comes across as really disingenuous, for employees. And so when you have experiences like that, when you see who's getting promoted and you kind of think to yourself, really, that person, they're kind of a bully. That's that's all part of culture, and that shows employees who you really are. So I think it's really important for organizations to match their words with their actions.
Yeah, I mean, how many times have we heard that the corporate hero hasn't got the values that perhaps we would like them to have, and it's more about the money than it is about the characteristics of that individual and how they conduct themselves. So, yeah, completely agree. All of this is really resonating with me. And I'd like to take a deeper dive into that leadership role, if I may, because I know that you've got a lot to offer on this subject. So, I was looking at a statistic which I thought was really interesting, that 63% of employees expect their CEO to take a stand on societal issues, including climate change and inequality. And I was just thinking that, leadership today is just, there's so much pressure around it because it's so much more than just running a business. And if leaders are expected to be vocal on issues like that, then how can they strike the right balance between, if you like, being vocal on these issues and advocacy, and then running their companies effectively?
Yeah, I this is such an important question, and it's an important question globally. It feels a particularly important question for me sitting in the United States. And I'll answer this by sharing something that I saw a talk by the CEO of Allstate Insurance a few years ago, and I just thought it was so brilliant, and something that all leaders could learn from. And what he said was, Allstate as an organization was being asked to kind of come out and sign a letter in support of this or against that, and all these letters that companies and leaders are asked to sign to comment on the issues such as those that you mentioned. And Allstate's leadership team said, we can't just sign every letter. We need to be thoughtful about how we're engaging in these topics. And so they developed a model, a framework called the Societal Engagement Framework. And it had four fundamental questions that they would ask themselves. Sort of, I guess, as a starting point, the issue had to be aligned with their values. So putting that aside, and assuming that the issue does, they ask themselves four fundamental questions. Will us taking a stand on this issue or leading on this issue be better for our customers? Sort of constituency number one. Do we know anything about this issue? Like, can we comment intelligently on it? Do we have any agency? Is there a way that we could affect change through our business, the relationships that we have? And then fourth, what will be the impact on our employees, and our reputations? Is this something that our employees are supportive of or not? And so they run all of these issues that through this framework and communicate to they communicated this framework to their shareholders and said, look, when we make decisions, this is what it's based on. So when we come out for something, know that it has gone through this filter. And when we're choosing not to take a stand on something, know that it didn't. And so an example is climate change. Scientists agree that the wildfires that are burning in LA right now, are have increased in their frequency and severity because of climate change. Wildfires are burning all states, customers, homes down. So, yes, this is an issue that matters deeply to our customers. It's something that they know about because in the insurance, world, of course, they're making decisions on likelihood and impact, et cetera, related to, in this, case, wildfires. They have agency. They can advocate with public utilities or state regulators or federal regulators on wildfires and climate change, and it's something that is really important to their employees. So that's an issue that they came out in front and said, we're going to lead on that. And abortion was another big issue, abortion access. And question number one: will it help us do a better job for our customers? Well, they don't offer health insurance, so it doesn't really have anything to do with their customers. Now, that doesn't mean they won't take any action about abortion related to abortion. It's part of their health care benefits that they provide to employees and ensuring that all employees, regardless of what state they live in and what the regulations of the state that they live in, will be able to have access to abortion care if they want. But it's not an issue that they're going to come out publicly in support of because it's frankly not their business. And so they shouldn't. And I so appreciate that framework. And I think that in our complex world where there are so many issues, so many perspectives and passion and anger and fear and sort of divisiveness around these issues, being able to really clearly say this is how I am making the decisions that I'm making and being transparent about that. I think even if people don't agree with the decision that you're making because they understand.
The rationale at least feels measured and reasoned, doesn't it? And I think there's some confidence that comes from that. Because from my perspective, I was thinking that statistic suggested to me that, they're going to have to be more vocal on issues. And there is a danger, isn't there, that you'll just be more cautious. And is that really what we want in terms of creating better leaders? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I definitely think that leaders are more cautious these days because so much of our politics have bled over into our workplaces. So it is true, but I think that the value of having some sort of decision making framework, it might not be all states, but it's your own. I think that helps leaders and organizations navigate these issues with more certainty. So they don't necessarily need to be as cautious. And they're also not being so distracted. To go back to the Allstate example, they can't sign every letter that comes their way. Like that would disrupt their ability to execute on the business that they need to be executing on. And so it's just it's providing that filter to figure out what's important to your organization, to your constituencies, your customers, your employees, and what is something that you really should kind of stay out of or address internally, but not necessarily publicly. Um, so it feels like a really strong suit of armor to me.
Yeah, and it's another opportunity to align with values as well. I think another survey that I read was that 77% of organizations now emphasize values over rules in motivating ethical behavior, which is something that we've been banging the drum for some time on. But if we've seen that increase and that shift is happening, then how are leaders or the better leaders embedding those values into their actions every day rather than just talking about them? Because if employees are looking for this now, and I think that's a definite trend, employees seem more vocal about what they're seeking from a leader and that it should be values based, then how are they actually demonstrating that other than things like that framework that you just mentioned?
Absolutely. And I think that that particular that particular statistic actually might have been from an LRN.
It was. I think it was, you're right. Yeah, with the recent one in 2024, you're right, yeah.
Yeah, but it's certainly supported by I've seen other similar research studies, which I think it's always helpful to kind of have these multiple data points to reference.
It's all empirical data, all helps us.
Right, right. And certainly, I see it just in my own work, and just in who I am as an employee and what I care about in the leaders, that I'm surrounded by. So, how can leaders demonstrate values rather than just talking about them? Well, I actually don't think that you can separate the words from the action in that both are important. I think explaining decisions is a really big part of it. I've seen this consistently in my work, where I or in an earlier part of my career, a lot of my work involved focus groups with employees of all different levels and functions within an organization. And that was one of the big themes, regardless of whether I was talking to people within a manufacturing company or a tech company or a healthcare company. It was, just wanting to understand why are we doing what we're doing? And so when you articulate your company goals for the year or your strategy for the year, being able to point back how those are aligned with your values, or aligned with your purpose, your mission, and communicating that in an aspirational way is very motivating to employees. And then how you communicate on the progress towards those goals throughout the year. The decisions that employees see leaders make, are they aligned with those principles that were articulated in January or in December for the next year, or do they seem different? So it's that matching the words with the actions. I think leaders been uncompromising in their fidelity to values, the organization's values, or to their own personal leadership values. So we talked a little bit earlier about the high performer that maybe is a little bit of a bully, not tolerating that. And that doesn't mean that you fire everyone, but maybe that individual needs some coaching, or some specific training, or even just a direct conversation of, hey, you're coming across as a little bit of a bully. This is not how we show up in this organization. I also think that it's important. This is not so much at an individual leader level, but at an organizational level. What I would love to see more organizations do is actively support their leaders in being better leaders. I think a lot of the times people are promoted into leadership positions or management positions because they're really great at what they do, and becoming a manager is sort of the next step in the promotion ladder within the organization. And that doesn't mean that you're a good leader. If someone has never, if you've never been given the tools, I kind of can't really fault people for. I think some people are naturally effective leaders, but not everybody is, and that doesn't mean that they can't be. So Absolutely, absolutely. So, training, I think, back to frameworks, I really do love frameworks, but having kind of a definition or a codification of this is what it means to be a leader at this organization. This is how we expect you to behave. And being explicit about those expectations, supporting leaders in developing those skills, those attributes, enabling them to be more effective with their teams. I don't think enough organizations invest in that, but those that do, and I have, I've had a number of clients that I've had the pleasure of working with for multiple years, so I've really gotten to see the change in their organization, and some organizations that have rolled out leadership programs in response to feedback, and then you get the feedback later about how they actually saw their manager improve. I mean, that's amazing. So we know that these kinds of programs work. Um, anyway, I think that's another way that organizations can help their leaders lead in a more values based way.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're saying as well that they're demonstrating authenticity. And I think that's the proof is in the pudding, isn't it? It's about action speaking louder than words. And I think it was Brené Brown who's famously said that authenticity is daily practice of letting go who we think we're supposed to be and then embracing who we are. So again, that back from training, right? Isn't it? It's about who we think we need to be. We're behaving and I think it as a manager. But if we're having training that really helps us connect with our values and demonstrate values through our behavior, I mean, I for one would love leadership like that. And I think we've both seen enough examples where, people really well meaning perhaps aren't being authentic because they're behaving in a way they think they should be. And that also interests me from a point of how leaders can cultivate authenticity in their environments, not just their own, because there's so much pressure on them to sort of project this perfection. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Have you ever seen a leader try and fake authenticity or, what's the tell sign?
Luckily, not any leaders that I have worked directly with, but I've certainly seen it in my clients. And I mean, it sounds so simple, but it really comes back to uh, having their actions not match their words. Saying we value respect in the workplace, but then promoting the bully who always exceeds their targets. People see through that so easily. I've just seen it again and again and again. And so I think the tell is saying all the right things, but not having that backed up by your actions. And the unfortunate reality is that trust is very hard to to build or to rebuild, and very very easy to lose. So it can really have a toxic effect on an organization or on a subgroup within that organization, that can take years to overcome, and sometimes is only overcome when that particular leader is gone.
Yeah. And I think trust is something we hear time and time again in relationships and in improving psychological safety for people. So they feel that they are not embarrassed or punished if they speak up or they take risks. And I think it was Google who did a study on was it Project Aristotle, where they had looked at 180 teams for 2 years, and they found that that ability to take risks or speak out without feeling embarrassed was down to that feeling of psychological safety. It seems like almost a game changer for these teams. So I wonder, again, just building on that trust element that you were talking about, how can leaders foster that psychological safety in their workplaces when they're under so much pressure to produce results?
I was really interested in that study when it came out. From a design perspective, I thought it was really well designed, and so I think it highlights the validity of the results. In terms of creating psychological safety, I think vulnerability is an important behavior or attribute for leaders to show, to be able to admit that you don't know the answer or that this is something that you're struggling over. That sends the signal to employees that it's okay for them to also not know or have questions or make mistakes. Leaders, they set the tone. And so if a leader is willing to be vulnerable and admit mistakes or, hey, we made a bet on this new acquisition and it didn't work out. And now we have to divest it and we're losing $10 million of our investment. We thought we got it, but we didn't. Being able to be open about that shows employees that they can do as well. That's one way that leaders can create psychological safety. Another way is, I think, really being curious about your employees, your teams, asking questions, and listening to them and showing them that you genuinely care, and you believe what they're saying. And I'll give a specific example. This is with a leader that I worked with in a previous organization where we had this really huge product launch in our organization, and it was a marquee. I mean, it was one of the biggest product launches that we had done in a while, and the the a few team members came to this leader, and I was in the room and said, we're killing ourselves. People are working nights and weekends and not being able to be with their family, and we don't have enough resources, we don't have enough people. We really feel that this product launch is threatened. We're afraid that we're making mistakes because we're trying to move too quickly to meet this deadline. And that feedback was listened to, it was believed, and the product launch was delayed. And sometimes that has to happen, rather than, I think, another leader could have said, um, "I'm really sorry. Sometimes this is just what we have to do. We have to work nights and weekends. I'm working nights and weekends too, and we just have to do it to get it done. And then afterwards, everyone can take a break." That would have been one way of handling it. Of course, another way could have been too bad, get it done anyway, which is obviously even worse. But what he did was he trusted what his people were telling him, and the burnout of the employees is one thing, but also the risk, like, we don't want to launch a product that's riddled with errors because people are working too fast and they're tired and they're making mistakes while they're coding, and so delaying the product launch, that's a really strong message that creates that psychological safety so people know I can come again if I have concerns. I think listening to your people and actually trusting your people, um, is a really, really important part of creating that psychological safety.
And that's really interesting. This A lot of this seems to be around the human side of leadership. And I mean, just talking around, you just mentioned burnout. I think that's something I hear a lot of. Um, and obviously, they're having to shoulder the burden of for their teams, these leaders, and they're having to just continue to meet targets and shoulder all the burden of the whole issues that have been thrown at them. But at the same time, they need to somehow ring fence their own mental health, um, and be vulnerable and courageous. And it's a big ask. And I wonder, how can they do that? How can they prioritize their own mental health without feeling that they're failing those teams that they've been looking after so diligently? And in your example, there would have been a lot of pressure on that person's shoulders for pushing the product launch date. And so, how would he have preserved his own mental health in the face of some adversity, I'm sure?
Yeah, yeah. I think this is so important, and I've seen it in leaders that I've worked with, both positively and the negative impacts. I've seen it in myself, in my role as a leader of teams, and I see it quite strongly in my role as a mom as well, and how I'm able to show up for my kids in ways that that I want to. Um, so I think there will always be some element of sacrifice, whether that's parenthood or organizational leadership, but it does have to be balanced. It does have to be tempered. You can't constantly be in a state of sacrifice. And that's something that I personally have struggled with in my journey as a leader. There are so many times where I felt that something needed to get done, but I didn't want to ask my my direct reports to work on the weekend. I didn't feel that I could do that, so then I'm the one that does it, and, every once in a while, that's okay, but then there's also the question of, well, does this really need to get done on the weekend? Or is there a way that we can, break it down into a few different component parts and kind of farm them out, or do we push the launch date? So that kind of sacrifice, is probably the element of leadership that I personally have struggled with the most, and I have approached or reached, experienced
You
burnout.
can't pour from an empty cup, Emily.
Yeah, yeah, you really can't. And so in terms of what leaders can do, when I read interviews about with leaders or about leadership, I think a trend that I often see is these highly successful leaders running huge operations, they tend to have a pretty strict personal routine or regime. And whether that's, working out every day in the morning or carving out 30 minutes to meditate or, the food that you're eating, taking a break to eat lunch away from your desk, always being home in time for dinner with your kids, and then maybe logging on after. It does seem to be a trend in those really highly successful leaders that are leading very large, complex operations. They have their personal routine and they stick to it and they do not break it. And I think that's important. It's
It's kind of leading by example, though, because then that makes everyone feel they have that ring fence time and the boundary is
Yeah,
set.
it's the boundaries. Absolutely. And in Ethisphere, one of the something that I really admire about several of the leaders at Ethisphere is they actually take vacation. Like, they take vacation and then they don't email you.
And boundaries.
Um, absolutely, absolutely. Like, I think it's great for them and makes them be more effective leaders, but as you said, it's that leading by example and showing employees, that vacation actually does mean vacation, and not just, checking your email every day from your phone.
Yeah, I have a colloquial story to share here, actually. So I went to an event last year and I was speaking to some quite senior lawyers in different organizations, just happened to be they were in a group together. And they were explaining that they find that the younger generations are much better at this. So they'll say, perhaps something needs to get done quite urgently. And they will literally push back and say, actually, I'm going for my morning run at that time. So I'll be in, and they were in shock, these ladies I was speaking to, because that's something they wouldn't have dreamed of telling their, superiors or whatever. But I think it shows a trend towards understanding the importance of preserving mental health, which I think is more a topic of conversation than ever it has been. And certainly with the leaders that I speak to is front of mind, whether that's, making time for exercise or family time. I think it's really important to get the balance right. And it's something that people will always struggle with. I think the balance will always be difficult. And it speaks to that sort of understanding of those, generation coming up and saying no to things. It's also about empathy. And I think that's a really important leadership. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that, because um, having empathy seems to be something, again, that I've seen in studies, seems to be more recognized. I think it was Deloitte did a study and they were talking about what the younger generations are seeking from leaders, and empathy was a trait that was identified. Have you got any thoughts about that?
I agree with that. I think that empathy goes hand in hand with that vulnerability that we were talking about before, and also with the decision making framework that we were talking about even earlier. Being able to understand people and being curious about them and trusting their experience and what they're saying, even if it's not something that you agree with, even if you make the decision anyway that they, that they might have been questioning, demonstrating that empathy and incorporating that into how you frame the decision that I'm going to take anyway, or the decision that we're going to take anyway, in a way that still shows the employees that their concerns have been heard, but this is why, we're not going to do it, or we're going to do something else. Communicating that decision making, that transparency, I think just really helps. Again, we can go along with it so much easier when we understand why, and when we know that we've been heard, that what we've said has been, believed and trusted. So I do think that empathy, vulnerability, these emotional IQ, the EQ, uh, uh, um, emotional intelligence is such a strong aspect of strong leadership.
You don't think people lose authority if they don't? I'm just playing devil's advocate, but
Yeah, no, and that's fair. But I think that I don't think that people lose authority if you have, because empathy doesn't mean bending to whatever anybody is saying or bringing it, or bringing to you. Empathy is about hearing and believing, even if you choose to make a different choice. And so having that that own conviction as a leader and knowing where you stand, but demonstrating that respect and care and compassion, for the people that are coming to you, with their own vulnerability. Empathy is I think a reaction, or a way of engaging with somebody else's vulnerability is a really important leadership trait, and I think will only grow in its importance, as our our workforces are changing, and the jobs that are available to humans are changing, and what we're expecting of people is changing. There's a lot of confusion and uncertainty in the world, and it has to be dealt with empathy.
I completely agree. And I think that it's something that I hear more and more is being valued. It's interesting you were saying about, the holidays and Ethisphere and how people, but that is part of empathy as well, isn't it? Because it's understanding that that time is essential for mental well-being. And if you're going to trespass across it all the time, then having been through it yourself, you're able to empathize that that's not conducive to productive workforce or a motivated workforce. And I think I've really enjoyed our conversation. I know our time's coming to an end, Emily, but I think with that in mind and to your point around vulnerability, what do you think leadership will look like in the next 10 years? Are we still going to be talking about these same themes? Or do you think there are bigger challenges on the horizon that might change that conversation?
I do think that we will be talking about a lot of these same themes, but I think that they'll be amplified. I also think that what we need from leaders will continue to change on the trajectory that I think that we're already on, in terms of that, that emotional intelligence, that the people management side of things, because we are in a period of really dramatic changes in business, and um we have the younger generation, with their different, ideas around boundaries and meaning in the workplace, that you mentioned. We have, the rise of AI that is changing the jobs that are available to people. And so I think that leaders are going to be increasingly called upon to think differently about the organizations that they're running, how they're structured, the talent that they need to execute on, their vision or their business purpose. Um, and in a time where our social issues and political issues blur into the workplace or are even, cannot even be disentangled from the workplace. So all of that together requires leaders that have that high emotional intelligence, and are able to inspire trust, are able to motivate uh, uh, motivate people to, go along, to join them on the journey. That's only going to be more important than, your ability to, um, balance the P&L.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to leave everyone with the same question, Emily. I've so enjoyed our conversation. I don't really want to end, but if you could create a leader's survival kit, what would you put in it?
I'm laughing because,
I'm mean, aren't I?
in a previous, in a previous organization, there was a bottle of wine that sort of floated around the office, and it had a sign on it that said, "Break glass in case of emergency."
An emergency.
However, I'll not advocate for alcohol as part of the leader's survival, although that is the first thought that came to my mind. But, in all seriousness, a leader's survival kit, I think you need to have a trusted voice that you can turn to, whether that's a mentor, whether that's a friend, whether that's a spouse, whether that's, another leader in your organization or in a different organization. Being a leader can be very isolating, and I don't think anybody should go through life alone. And so having someone that you can talk to, I would say is sort of survival kit, number one. And that's the leadership alliance that I mentioned for Ethisphere. I mean, that's the goal.
All call forums.
Or yes, exactly, exactly. That's the goal is to create those spaces to have those conversations. And number two, I think I actually find a lot of value in, those kind of personality trait, behavior style tests that teams can do, whether that's business chemistry or strength finders, or there's a whole host out there. Whether you're doing it just for yourself as a leader to understand, and be able to put a name to, your strengths, but also your blind spots, or your weaknesses. Even better if you can do it with your team so that you understand kind of where your team members are coming from and how to best engage with them in a most productive way. I think that can be a really powerful tool, uh, um, um, for leaders in understanding themselves as well as their teams. And then lastly, in the leader's survival kit, I think it's knowing your own personal values and your red lines in the sand, having that conviction, whether that's a decision making framework, or just a set of values, and reflecting on that, from time to time. I think that's how leaders can continue to follow their own North Star, and not be led astray. You have to know who you are and what you stand for, and what leadership means to you, and really be critical about how well you're living up to that.
Well, I think we'll do very well if we beat that. That's incredible. Thank you, Emily. What a toolkit. And thank you for joining us. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much. That's it for today's episode of Insights from the Coalface, elevating leadership beyond the boardroom. I hope this conversation left you with fresh insights, new perspectives, and a deeper connection to the challenges and opportunities of leadership. If you found value in today's discussion, I'd love for you to share it with your network, leave a review, or reach out to me with your thoughts. Leadership can be a lonely road, but it doesn't have to be. Let's keep learning, growing, and supporting each other. Until next time, stay resilient, stay authentic, and keep leading with purpose.